Welcome to How to Lose a Girl in 10 Days, the podcast where we talk about the opinions of old people and young people, from fair wages, carbon zero, sheen halls, and everything else in between. Kia ora everybody, welcome back to How to Lose a Girl in 10 Days. My name is Holly.
And I'm Xandi, and today we have a very special guest. We have Chris Bishop, who is National Spokesperson for Housing, Urban Development, Infrastructure, ranked third in the national lineup, and also you're the chef of the 2023 election campaign. Is that correct?
Correct. Good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Fantastic. Anything else you want to add on to that long list of responsibilities, I suppose?
No. I'm keen to lose a few. I'm just joking. I am keen to know what's the background of the name for the podcast?
Everybody asks us this.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, it's okay. I think it's a kind of an us problem, really. It's supposed to be a bit of an ironic take, like a bit of a cell phone of like, everybody finds politics boring and like it's kind of funny because nobody will like you if you talk about politics, but it's supposed to be a reverse on that. So we make politics interesting.
It's also sort of a riff from the movie How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days.
Okay, got
so
it.
it's based on that, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It obviously doesn't translate well though, so maybe it's something we need to work on.
I think it's a millennial thing.
Perhaps.
Maybe.
It's funny. But yes, so we've got some just questions like about yourself. Why did you get into politics?
Mm-hmm.
What's your kind of background?
Mm-hmm.
What inspired you to, get ahead in all this?
Well, I am turning 40 this year. When I first became an MP, I was actually one of the younger MPs, which is now 9 years ago. So I was 31 when I became an MP. So I'm turning the big 4-0, which is a bit scary. But yeah, I mean, I went to Vic. So where we're sitting right now recording this podcast, I spent quite a bit of time. So I used to do a bit of news reporting for Salient back in the day, a few opinion pieces. If you look up Salient 03, you guys probably weren't born.
That was the year I was born.
Okay,
I was around for a year
embarrassing.
before that.
Okay, oh, that's good. Well, you were one. Okay, so if you look up Salient 03 and 4, you can see some, sort of fairly hot-headed opinion pieces from me. So yeah, I went to Vic, did a law degree here and an arts degree, spent a bit of time up at the Pulsar department under Margaret Clark and John Johansson and a few others, did law down at Papatea. Grew up in the Hut, so Central Lower Hut. My mum was a journalist. My mum was a lawyer. So studied law. My dad was a journalist. Back in the 70s and 80s, did politics and so grew up in quite a political family. And so yeah, always interested in politics, always interested in law. Studied at university, and people always go, oh, did you always want to be an MP? And then the honest answer is, sort of. I was always interested. I did a lot of debating at university, at school as well. Was in the debating society up here, and after I left school, I was going to go be a boring corporate lawyer. And Nicola Willis, actually, my colleague, our deputy leader, was working for John Key at the time. That was when National was in opposition last time around. Rang me up and said, don't go and do law. Don't go work at Russell McVeigh. Come and work for John Key. He's going to be the next Prime Minister. Exciting. And I went, okay, that's a pretty exciting opportunity. So yeah, worked in the National Research Unit doing speech writing and policy and stuff like that. And then National won in 2008, obviously, and spent a bit of time in government. And yeah, and then kind of one thing led to another and became an MP in 2014. So yeah, a bit of a political animal. And yeah, here I am.
Awesome.
Thank you for that.
Very exciting. So just as a little bit of context, so for people who are a little unsure about kind of what the National Party stands for, we've kind of got some quick fire questions to kind of get the ball rolling.
Okay.
So these are yes or no, unless otherwise specified. So
it's always
very
tough
quick.
with politicians, but yeah, sure.
Exactly, that's the point.
So for our first question, in 5 words or less, what do you think is the most important issue facing young people today?
Housing affordability.
Good answer. Awesome.
All right. Do you plan to increase mental health support for university students in New Zealand?
Yes.
Awesome, good answer. Do you support increased funding to public transport?
Yes.
Cool.
Will you revoke fees free for university students?
We are working
yes
out.
Or no?
I'm not going to give you a yes or no. We'll have more to say about our fiscal plan closer to the election.
Okay.
Cool.
And your favourite musician?
I'm a huge Shehard fan. I know they're not National Party fans, but my favourite band is Shehard.
Favourite song?
You want me to say Five Eyes or Think You're So Free, which is the album they wrote about the last national government, but it's not. No, I'm a big fan of their 1994 Killjoy record.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Very nice. Cool. Okay, so I think housing and like affordability, things like that, it kind of leads into a first kind of point of discussion of cost of living. So what are National's plan to kind of reduce the impact, especially for young people these days? Obviously, it's a big issue. It's a big highlight of your kind of campaign. So, what are kind of policies that you have in place to help young people?
So it's really important for everyone, but particularly for students, obviously. And housing costs are a massive one for students, right? And you will all know this, and many of your listeners will as well. Rents in Wellington are just completely out of control. And I actually think some of the financial problems that Vic University is experiencing at the moment is because of that. And I know people your age and many people listening who have actively made the decision to go to Auckland or go to Canterbury because the rents there are lower, and rents in Wellington are just insane. And so the best thing we can do in central government is fix our housing market, and that's what we're really focused on. So we need more rentals, we need more supply across the whole of the housing continuum. So private rentals, social housing, private sector housing. We just need more houses in Wellington and the whole country, frankly, as well, to keep a lid on rent rises and put downward pressure on rents, not upward pressure on rents, and provide livable conditions for people, warm and dry homes that should be the right of every New Zealander to live in. You know, over the last 30 years, we have seen just a public policy disaster when it comes to housing. We've seen this largest house price growth in the OECD, essentially the Western world, in the last 20 years. And it's just it's a public policy disaster, and it doesn't have to be this way. We are not a small country. We're only 5 million people, but our land mass is the size of the United Kingdom. And we've just made it very difficult to build houses in this country because of planning rules and artificial constraints on what we do in our cities, but also on the edges of our cities. So that's what we're very focused on, and I'm passionate about it, as you can probably tell. Awesome, that's one of the reasons why I'm in Parliament, is to try and fix those problems. The answers are complicated, but not insolvable. They can't be. Other countries have got more affordable housing than we do, so we've been doing a lot of things wrong for the last 20 years.
Definitely a way forward.
It's definitely a way forward.
Yeah, but when you say, when you say increasing supply of housing, what does that look like? Like what are some policies that you have to put forward to try and address that?
Well, we'll have our housing policy out in due course. But
can we get a teaser?
Yeah, I'll give you a little taste test. So I think it's both going out at the edge of our cities, but also up. So where we're sitting right now in sort of central Wellington, Kelburn, and around the Aro area. There is potential for more density. We need more apartments. It's as simple as that. We need more apartments in our cities and in and around our major transport routes, for example, near buses, near trains. And we're very lucky in Wellington, where we've got a fantastic train network running out to Kapiti, into Johnsonville, but also the Hutt Valley, where I'm from. Fantastic services when the trains turn up on time and when the rail network's maintained properly, and we've got a pretty good bus network too, again, when we have drivers and all that. So
currently not so fantastic services.
Not so fantastic, but has been good in the past.
Yeah.
Certainly when I grew up in the Hutt. I took the train. I didn't own a car till I was 25.
Yeah.
My first car I bought when I was 25, because I just took the train to school in Upper Hutt in Trentham, and I took the train into town when I had things in town, and I walked to in and around Lower Hutt. So I'm an example of how it's possible to live without a car.
Indeed.
And there are lots of people like that,
lots
right?
Of students as well.
Correct.
Yeah.
There are lots of students like that. So we need walking, cycling, scootering, which didn't exist, when I was around. So and e-bikes didn't exist, So making all of that easier is part of the solution. So we need density in our cities, but we also need to go out at the edge of our cities. And in Wellington, that's more challenging than it is in a place like Auckland, for example, but there are greenfields developments in Wellington. Wainui-a-Mata, for example, in Lower Hutt, where I am a List MP based. We can do 2,000 new homes in Wainui-a-Mata. You literally go over the Wainui-a-Mata hill, hang a left at Parkway, and you've got house, and then you hit the end of the road, and it's farmland. And the council's got plans to do 2,000 new homes in Wainui-a-Mata North, it's called. Why aren't we doing that?
True.
We should be doing that.
I think that the only question that I have there is it not better to concentrate their effort going up in the cities, given that it's probably going to be cost more money to have sufficient water and transport and all that other infrastructure that comes with going outwards? Why should we not concentrate it just in going upwards? I
think you need to do a bit of both, right? Because you need a range of housing typologies that suit everybody. So for students, many of them don't want to live in Wainui-a-Mata North. It's probably an hour, from Wainui to Wellington for uni. It's too far. Many students want to live in and around the university, get that, on-campus feel, and enjoy the great, hospitality and nightlife that Wellington has. Choosing my words carefully. So that's fine. But for a family of mum and dad and 2 kids and Saturday morning sport, they want to maybe live in the suburbs, and you need housing choice is my point. So there'll be different typologies of housing, different types basically that suit different people, and our planning system not only doesn't facilitate that choice at the moment, but artificially constrains what we can do. So we're having this big debate in Wellington at the moment around densifying in places like Mount Victoria, for example, places like Johnsonville, not actually that far from the city, essentially city fringe suburbs, and similar things going on in Auckland. And we do need to make it easier to build in these parts of the city.
I mean, on that point though, I was just reading a headline recently that suggested that Luxon has gone out and said that he no longer supports the medium density residential standards, which, if you aren't listening, make it easier to build higher up in the cities, and instead prefers greenfield developments. So what is your take on that?
So we'll have our full housing policy out in due course. But I think we've always said because the medium density residential standards, for those listening, was essentially a bipartisan deal done between National and Labor to make it easier to build. And we've always said we've been open to sensible changes around it. There is a bit of pushback from some communities around just how mandatory they are in particular parts of the community. And so we've always said we're open to sensible changes around that. But I do want to stress that we are in favour of more housing, and things like apartment developments around train stations and going up near rapid transit, for example, is absolutely fundamental and critical, and we're in support of that.
Cool. Just further on the kind of subject of housing, obviously it's a big issue. We were talking to Jessica Hammond from TOP, and her take was kind of the culture around housing as an investment in New Zealand is quite problematic because it creates like artificial competition in the market, which makes it worse because it drives up house prices. What do you think about that? Because a lot of people are saying we need to move like investment away from housing and things like that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I hear her point. I think it misdiagnoses the problem. The problem is the planning system and an inability of our system to respond to demand. So what I mean by that is, in an ordinary market, and housing is a market, in an ordinary market, if there's a demand for something, supply comes in to meet that demand, right? So you want avocados at the supermarket, the supply meets that demand. It's the same for any sort of consumer good. In housing, there is high demand for housing, and Wellington's a classic example of high demand for housing because people want to live here because we've got a great city. But supply it's extremely difficult for supply to meet that demand. As a result of the supply constraints, demand just pushes the price up. That's why rents in Wellington are so high. There's not enough rental housing. It's as simple as that. There's not enough rents, not enough rental housing. And so the price that landlords can charge just rises all the time. What we want to do is alter that situation so it's not landlords driving rentals and driving the price of it and that they have all the power. It's the other way around. So students have all the power, and young people have all the power, and people in the rental market have all the power because there's so much rental properties available, so many rental properties available, that landlords actually compete amongst themselves to get students or get renters into the property. The way in which you do that is by loosening those planning restrictions and those requirements on where and when you can build. So I think I hear what she's saying, but the way through it is not to because they're in favour of things like capital gains taxes and things like that. The way through that dilemma is not to whack a tax on. The way through is to create so many abundant development opportunities in our cities and at the edges of our cities that the artificial gain that people can make through housing investment is eroded because the artificial constraints that drive that development margin are eradicated. Like it's all artificial, right? So like we just in Auckland, for example, we just draw a ring around Auckland and say you can only build here, and once you go a kilometre beyond the limit, you can't build. Well, unsurprisingly, that drives up the price of land inside the limit, and that just suffuses its way through the rest of the market and drives up the price of land and housing, and therefore housing everywhere else in the city. And the Productivity Commission's done a lot of work on this. The Infrastructure Commission, which the government set up, has done a lot of work, just recently released a paper on this. So that's the ultimate answer. It's really complicated. I'm not saying it's not. I'm not saying it's not complicated. It is. But that's the answer. And
sure.
I think I've given you a bit of a steer as to where we're going.
Of
Fair
course,
enough.
of course.
Actually, on that point, there's been a talking points recently in the States, at least, that there's this big trade-off between renting, like between keeping rents cheap and letting people buy houses, because obviously supply and demand arguments, people buy houses, takes rentals off the market, and there's big talk that policymakers should be making an effort to make sure rents are cheaper rather than trying to allow people to buy their first homes. So, what is your personal take on that?
Well, I think it's not a binary. So, making rents cheaper makes it easier to buy a first home because many people renting are saving for a deposit, right? And that's why housing unaffordability is so bad at the moment for young people. People who've left university have keep renting to try and save a deposit. Typically they'd get a job and start earning money, start paying back the student loan, start to think about buying a house. 20, 30 years ago, it was possible in New Zealand to buy a house, in your 20s with a couple or not. That is just bloody hard now because rents are just out of control. And then you've got the LVR restrictions on top of that, so you need a 20% deposit. The fifth biggest bank in this country is the bank of mum and dad. That's how most young people, or many young people, I should say, get a deposit together. Their parents loan them money, right? And that's terrible for their parents, terrible for the young person, creates all sorts of family drama. And it's just an appalling state of affairs. Like, why is our fifth biggest bank the bank of mum and dad? It's atrocious. So we need to get back to the idea that you can rent for a while, sure, but you can get a deposit together to buy a house. And that's ultimately, you've got to get house prices down so that those things become affordable. And rents are at a moderate level. Landlords make a return. It's an investment class for them. That's all good. But people can earn a good weekly income, and the difference between their outgoings on rent and their weekly income is what you can save, plus food costs and stuff on top of that as well. So it's a big driver of the cost of living crisis for students is rents, and actually, frankly, also for families, because a lot of families are now refixing their mortgages at 6.5%, potentially higher, 7% on a fixed term rate. 2 years ago, they were 2.5%. So people are now paying hundreds, in some cases thousands of dollars a week more in interest costs and mortgage costs on a weekly basis. So again, it takes a massive chunk out of people's salaries. And again, that is all driven by house prices.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think cost of living and housing are really kind of interchanged. They're really the same thing at this point, aren't they?
Well, they are for many of your listeners, I think.
Well, actually, just one last question on the housing stuff. So the building more houses is obviously like a long-term, medium-term solution.
Yeah.
Does National have any proposals for short-term problems? Like, for instance, obviously this is a radical proposal, but like a rent cap or something along those lines. Does National have any sort of short-term policies to try and make it easier to rent?
We're not in favour of a rent cap, and there are a couple of political parties who are in favour of it. It would be counterproductive. It really would. So no, we won't be doing that. And economists don't agree on everything, but the two things they kind of generally agree on, 90% of them, is free trade is good and rent controls are bad. So yeah, we're not going to be doing that.
Fair enough. Back to the kind of cost of living things. Obviously, National has a lot of discussion about lowering taxes for New Zealanders. Obviously, that can probably see some kind of like benefit for students keeping more of their money. I think probably less so for students and people who earn more money just because of the way that progressive tax systems work, correct. Right? But does that mean that for students that probably has a negative impact, because when you're taking money, out of the government budget and giving it back to people, that just leaves you with less money to deliver on social services like healthcare and education? Will that, come out of your budget in some kind of way? Yeah,
so we will present our fiscal plan close to the election, but you just got to take a step back a bit and say government spending's up 69% in the last 6 years, right? So there's been a very large increase in government spending. Government's now taking an extra tax, $28,000 per household, for every household in the country, more than they did 6 years ago. I would put it to you that you've not seen a 69% increase in effectiveness of government spending, even though they're taking all that money in. So
is that accounting for inflation?
That includes inflation. And inflation's high at the moment. So have we seen a 69% increase in quality in the health system? Actually, on most metrics, the health system's gone backwards. Same thing with education. Child poverty has certainly not moved by 69% downwards. So there's a lot of waste in the system, and there's a lot of, and I would argue, I would put it to you and argue that the system is very unfocused. So When you put in place clear accountability and clear metrics for success and gear the public service system up to deliver those, you can achieve really good outcomes. And I'll give you the example of emergency department wait times, for example. Mental health is an area that you mentioned in the quickfire. $2 billion put into mental health in 2019, 4 years ago now. I don't know many people who would say the mental health system's better now than it was 4 years ago. And it's a real problem for New Zealand. So it's not always about money. It's often about the way in which you gear the system up and give it clear accountabilities and clear targets, and also leadership from a ministerial level.
Yeah, I think for those who don't really understand the concept of principled or focused spending, what does that actually look like? For students who actually just don't really know what you're talking about when when you say that.
Put it into a student context. Many people listening, and probably you guys too. You live pretty frugally. You go through your weekly expenses and go, rightio, I've got my student allowance or my student loan living costs, depending on your circumstances, plus your weekly income from working, which many students do now. You put all that in, and you go, rightio, here's my weekly incomings, and what are my weekly outgoings, which is your rent, food costs, transport, all your basics, same as any other household does. The government is no different, and actually, at a time of cost of living crisis, governments, you guys are almost certainly pretty frugal about what you spend money on. Government should be the same. There's a lot of fat in the system. We've got 14,000 more public servants in Wellington compared to 6 years ago. There is a lot of stuff that I just look at and say, why are we doing this? So $55 million wasted on a cycle bridge that got cancelled. Didn't even end up building it. Let's get Wellington moving, which is the transport program to try and make it easier to get around Wellington. Everyone's in favour of it. In 6 years, they've built a pedestrian crossing on State Highway 1, and the business cases are costing hundreds of millions of dollars for projects that will end up being built. That is a lot of fat in the system. Communication staff at the health department or the health agency running ads on Instagram to get people to fill out surveys as to how bad the health system is. Tens of $1,000 contract. There's lots of little things that really add up, and certainly when I talk to people on the health system, for example, they say, there's $5 billion more being spent per year on the health system, but we don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough doctors in the system, but there's a lot of middle management. There's a lot of people sitting in the back office, writing reports and stuff. So it's not about. It is partly about increasing spending, but it's about where that spending goes.
Right.
And so, like every other household does, you've got to go through line by line and go, rightio, that's a nice to have. We're not doing that. That doesn't move the dial. We're cutting that. And that's what every household has to do, and it's what government should do as well.
Okay, that makes sense. But zooming out a little bit, does that sort of look like a policy of austerity, or does that look like just a policy being more sensible spending?
People sort of say austerity. Austerity would be like cutting government spending to below what it was in 2017. And it's essentially a 69% reduction. Government spending has massively increased in the last 6 years. What we're saying, and we'll present our fiscal plans close to the election, so I don't want to jump the gun and get ahead of Nicola, she'll kill me. But I just reject the idea that we've got so much more spending in the system, reprioritising that spending and focusing it on better areas, that's not austerity. That is just sensible reprioritisation. And we think tax brackets, so that the rate at which you start paying tax at a particular income level, have not changed since 2010. People on average incomes are about to start paying the middle rate of income tax, the 30-cent rate. And so people are just being pushed into higher and higher tax brackets because of inflation. It's what's called fiscal drag. And it's a real problem. And so we don't think it's unreasonable to say, you know what, we are going to put more money in New Zealanders' back pockets. So you said before, it's sort of government money. It's only government money once it gets taken from people. Before that, it's individuals' money. It's New Zealanders' money. Okay. So we don't think it's unreasonable to say, we're going to let you keep more of what you earn. And it's a pretty moderate tax plan. We're the party of that. So. Yeah. Fair
enough.
Okay. You've a couple of times just during this interview, you've basically talked about how you're not going to release the tax, like your cost of fiscal plan for a while now.
I said soon.
Soon. I think Luxon said 4 weeks out from the election, maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends. It depends what you're talking about. I mean...
sorry, what's sort of the rationale for that? Because I know, like, ACT has already released their costed plan, and they're going to change some numbers around once the figures come out.
They sort of have. It's a bit loose. But, so in election year, you've got the budget in May, which we just had last week, 4 or 5 days ago. Well, last week, actually, so a week ago. And then the government has to publish what's called the pre-election economic and fiscal update, which is it's done by the Treasury, actually. It's the Treasury's kind of best forecast estimates and things like that. And so when you're in opposition, you're stuck in this dilemma a little bit where people go, well, how much is your stuff going to cost and what's your plan and all the rest of it? And then it quickly gets out of date because there's more economic data and it comes through and things like that. So if you announce everything too early, people go, oh, well, hang on a minute, like that's cost has changed and the forecast's different and all the rest of it, and you're wrong and you're out of date and blah, blah, blah. And you say, well, yeah, and then you have to update it, but then the numbers, potentially confuse people. So we will present our plans, not today, not a week after the budget, but, soon. And there's 4 months to go to the election and people will be able to see where we propose spending money and where we don't. And what we see the fiscal forecast looking. And it's exactly the same thing that Labor did, by the way, prior to the 2017 elections. It's no different. It affects it's the same for every opposition in election year every time.
So wait, just to clarify that, you're going to publish your spending. You're going to publish that spending document before the pre-election economic forecast or after?
Nicola's in charge of that, and we will. Yeah. She's in charge of that, and she's in charge of the timing. But we will be very clear and upfront with New Zealanders about what we're proposing.
Awesome. Okay. Now on to kind of environment, and I think this is quite a pressing issue for young people. Like I just know a lot of young people who are simply unwilling to vote for the National Party because they feel like you just do not prioritise climate change as like a big part of your policy.
Yeah.
I think what's your response to that, and also what climate policy do you have or maybe plan to put in place to kind of deal with those? I find
it sort of quite frustrating because. And I accept that that's a common view amongst young people, which I find frustrating, and let me do my best to dispel people's ideas. I mean, the first point is that the last national government actually did a huge amount for the environment. We established dozens of marine reserves around the country. We were the first government to firstly, find out what was happening in our rivers and lakes. So prior to 2008, we had basically no data or no knowledge about how bad the water quality was in our rivers and our lakes. We put in place the scientific monitoring regime to do that, and then after that we put in place the requirement to set a baseline level for river and lake quality, and then that got progressively raised over time. Like we did that. That was a national government that did all that. Did a lot of marine reserves as well, as I mentioned, a lot on waste and recycling. Anyway, leave all that aside. In terms of the future, one of the policies that I'm particularly passionate about is electrification of New Zealand. So we've released this policy called Electrify New Zealand. We're a world leader in renewable energy. About 85% of our electricity on any given day is renewable, so hydro, geothermal, wind energy. We have the best wind in the world. You go out to Macra, West Wind, people fly into Wellington, they can see it. they fly in. It's 43% capacity factor. So in other words, it's running almost 1 and 2 times. So we've got the best wind in the world. We've got amazing hydro resources. We've got geothermal. We've got solar. We've got incredible renewable resources. Our vision is to double renewable electricity generation by 2050, which will allow the mass electrification of the New Zealand economy. So it means more electric buses, for example. It means more electric cars. It means more electric trains on our train network. It means Fonterra switching their coal boilers to dry milk to electricity as well. Electrification of the New Zealand economy can drastically reduce our carbon emissions, but it means we can grow the economy at the same time. The cheapest form of energy in New Zealand is renewable energy, and we have bucket loads of it. The issue is the planning system and the consenting system. It sounds incredibly boring, but it's true. It takes 7 years on average to consent a wind farm. Why does it take 7 years to build a wind farm? Why does it take 7 years to reconsent an existing geothermal power station? That's nuts. All of that cost gets put into the system, drives up price, makes it very difficult for people building the stuff to get it away at an economic rate. So we need to radically reform our planning system. And it's not just me who says this, by the way. It's not just National Party propaganda. It's the Infrastructure Commission says it. The electricity companies say it. All of the experts, Transpower, who run the national grid, they say it as well. We need to make it much, much easier to build renewable electricity. And then we need the charging network for electric cars. Then we need to continue to electrify our train network. And at the last election, we campaigned on electrifying the line further down in Auckland. And we need more electric buses on our roads. So the opportunities for New Zealand are so big. We can and should be a world leader in the electrification of New Zealand, and we're very excited about that.
Cool.
Okay.
Awesome. I think that kind of links into what we were asking about public transport before. So you say that you're going to increase funding. I think that's, I think a lot of people have a conception of the National Party as really liking, roads and cars. That's always kind of the line that ends up kind of coming
so many
out.
Preconceptions about
I know there is, but I think this is your chance to kind of dispel them, right?
There's so many preconceptions. like we City Rail Link in Auckland, which I know many of your listeners won't know about, but that's the it's a rail link in Auckland. Literally, it's a loop. It allows it essentially adds 16 lanes of state highway traffic into Auckland. Is the way to think about it on the rail network. We started that. That's a national government project. We funded that. It's going to finish in 2026. So hopefully I'll get to cut the ribbon on it. But it's been built for the last few years.
Okay.
We started that. The electrification of the Auckland rail network, we did.
Yeah.
We extended the commuter rail to Waikanae. So for anyone listening from Waikanae, the ability to get on a commuter train into the Wellington network, that was under a national government. So, preconceptions are funny ideas.
But actually, speaking of that, obviously there's been a lot of news articles about the passenger train movement and a lot of protests in Wellington, at least, trying to stop traffic and stuff.
Yes,
so does National sort of support extending our rail network, passenger rail at least, out to other cities from Wellington?
Where it makes sense, right? So the capital connection between Palmy and Wellington is good. But the idea of passenger rail between, say, Wellington and Napier, it's just very hard to see that economically stacking up. You've got there's not a limitless pot of funds, right? So you could run a passenger rail from Wellington to Napier. You could. Would there be the demand there for it? Would the price per seat make it justifiable? If a system is making hundreds of millions of dollars of loss, for example, that always be paid for by somebody. I would rather focus the system on improving the system where we already have demand and we already have the population density, right? So the City Rail Link in Auckland makes a huge amount of sense because it basically adds a loop to the network and complicated, but the simple way to think about it is it allows more trains to run at a higher frequency across the entirety of the Auckland network. So that means the line out west, the line out east, and the line down the Puanui line. You can do more trains, and that means people who live near those train stations it's easier for them to get the train, so more people will use the train. That's a no-brainer. That's a great investment. Wellington, same thing. Government's just announced they're going to buy 16 new trains, electric trains for the network. Brilliant. We support that. Essentially they've stolen our policy. We campaigned on it in 2020. It's a good policy. It means that more people will take the train in Wellington. Excellent. Cool. That's a very good idea. Spending money on, passenger rail between, Hamilton and Palmy, I'm not sure that's a great use of money. I'm just not sure the economics stack up. But we are in favour of rail, but it's got to be in the right place. Give you another example. Hamilton and Tauranga is a part of the rail network which is largely used for freight because you've got the inland port there at Waikato in Hamilton, and you've got Tauranga Port, the biggest port in the country, and the freight makes a lot of sense there. Upgrades to that rail line make a lot of sense because the more freight we can get on rail is not in trucks on the road holding up traffic, and it's better for the environment too, by the way, because rail is. So that makes a lot of sense. So we're in favour of rail investment, but it has to be sensible. It has to be where it makes sense.
Fair enough. On that, can I ask you a hypothetical then?
Yeah.
Would you support maybe a passenger rail network from Wellington to Auckland? Because I know we currently have the Northern Explorer.
We used to have it, but no one took it.
No one took it, but would you support bringing it back? Because
probably not. No, because no one took it, and I'll tell you why they didn't take it. It's because it takes a really long time, and it was very expensive to try and wash its own face economically, and you can just fly, or drive.
If only we had the Japanese bullet trains, right?
but that's what everyone says, right? But it's never going to happen in New Zealand.
No, of course.
So people go, I go to Sydney and they've got amazing trains. Well, yeah, they've got the size of New Zealand in one city. Or they go to Melbourne and it's like great and all the rest of it. Or they go to London where they've got the tube. It's like, yes, London is 25 million people. They're 5 times our population in one urban centre.
Yeah.
So like that's why density is good, because density creates economic demand for these sort of services. But Auckland is over 1 million people, and that stuff makes sense. But the idea of like regular trains between Auckland and Wellington, I mean, you could do it. It just cost a lot of money, and as I say, there's no limitless cash pile for infrastructure. We've got to focus on where we can make the biggest bang for your buck. And you could run an Auckland rail like tomorrow, or in a year or so. You could go Auckland Wellington. Yeah, we're going to do 3 trains a day or something, and you could do it, and it would lose a lot of money, and the government would have to pay for that. You'd all pay for it through your taxes. I would rather take the same amount of money and extend the rail line to Otaki, for example, because Otaki is on the rail network, but they're not part of the commuter network. And there's big housing growth up there, big housing growth. I'd rather run more trains from the Wairarapa, because Wairarapa's growing. Carterton, Greytown, Masterton. It's on the Hutt Valley line, comes in through the tunnel, goes into Wellington. I'd rather do more in Auckland, for example. You go out west in Auckland, for example. You go out to Kumeu. They can't take a train. They've got a railway line, but they can't because they need to enlarge the size of the tunnel. I'd rather do stuff like that. That stuff makes sense. So let's get all that stuff done first before we start sort of talking about stuff that's. I'd put it in the nice to have category rather than the kind of must dos. Because there's no limitless pot of money. That's the sad reality.
Cool. Thank you very much for chatting to us today. I think that
I
kind of
probably talked too long. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I think we've kind of wrapped up most of our times. But yeah, if there's kind of like a final statement you'd like to add or anything you'd like to plug.
I just wanted to say it's great to it's great to be able to talk policy on a show, and I hope it wasn't too boring for people. But I think it's great that you're doing this.
Yes.
Who else have you had on?
Only Jessica Hammond, but we hope to have. We've got some arrangements with other people coming
great.
up, so
Yeah, good.
hopefully soon
all
as
my
well.
competitors.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Exactly.
It's totally fine.
So hopefully that should be fun. It's very good for people to actually hear what it means for them. I think there's a very big divide in kind of like what politicians say will happen versus what you actually understand to be happening to you. So I think it's always good to have the kind of personal conversations about what it means for people.
Oh,
so thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Awesome.